On a stormy night in Chicago, a struggling father pushes a squeaky grocery cart through the streets with his daughter. Desperation clings to him. No home, no stable job, no way out, only a single source of income from washing dishes. But when they come across a woman stranded with a luxury car, he offers to help, even at the risk of losing the only money keeping them afloat. What he doesn't know is that the woman is the CEO of a major automotive company, and the kindness he just gave is the very thing that will change his life. The rain hammered against the cracked pavement, turning the Chicago streets into a network of shimmering puddles and murky streams. Darius Carter tightened his worn-out jacket, pulling Ariel closer as she skipped beside him, her tiny pink rain boots splashing with every step. The cold wind bit through the fabric, but he barely noticed. His mind was heavy with the weight of the day, a weight that had been pressing down on him for months. His last paycheck was gone. His landlord had given them until sunrise to clear out. There was no backup plan, no safety net. Just the bag slung over his shoulder and the small hand gripping his fingers. "Daddy, look," Ariel's excited voice cut through his thoughts. She pointed across the street to where a sleek silver Mercedes was parked at an awkward angle, its hazard lights blinking in the darkness. A woman stood beside it, struggling with a flimsy umbrella, her other hand gripping a phone as she barked something into it. The tension in her posture was unmistakable: frustration, helplessness, urgency. Darius hesitated. He needed to get to the diner. It was just a dishwashing job, but it was a shift, something to keep them moving forward, even if only by inches. But then Ariel tugged his sleeve. "She looks sad," she murmured, peering up at him with those wide brown eyes. "Maybe we can help." A sigh escaped him, curling into the cold night air. He was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of struggling, tired of always being the one to do the right thing when the world never seemed to return the favor. But he couldn't say no to Ariel, not when she still believed in kindness like it was a law of nature. "All right, kiddo," he said, forcing a smile. "Let's go see." They crossed the street, rain beating against their shoulders, and as they got closer, the woman turned to face them. Her sharp features were partially obscured by damp strands of blonde hair sticking to her forehead. She was dressed in a tailored blue coat, but it did little to shield her from the storm. Darius lifted a hand in greeting. "Flat tire." The woman looked him over quickly, and he knew the moment she made her assessment. Her grip on her phone tightened slightly, eyes flicking between him and Ariel. A black man in ragged clothes approaching her at night. Suspicion flashed across her face before she masked it with forced politeness. "Yes," she said, shifting uncomfortably. "I called roadside assistance, but they're taking forever and I have a meeting." "I can change it," Darius interrupted, not interested in her explanations. He'd seen that look before, felt that hesitation. He knew how this worked. She didn't trust him, but she also didn't have another option. The woman blinked, caught off guard. "Are you sure?" "It's pouring, and she glanced at Ariel. "Your daughter." "She'll be fine," Darius said, evenly rolling up his sleeves. "I've done this 100 times. Ariel beamed, stepping forward to hold the umbrella over her father as he crouched beside the car. "My daddy's really good at fixing things," she said cheerfully, directing the comment at the woman. "He says kindness is free, so we should share it with everyone." The woman let out a small, almost reluctant chuckle, but Darius didn't look up. He worked quickly, muscles moving on instinct despite the rain numbing his fingers. The whole process took less than 15 minutes. By the time he stood up, wiping his wet hands on his jeans, the new tire was in place. The woman exhaled in relief. That was fast. She pulled a wallet from her coat pocket and held out a crisp $100 bill. "Here." Darius barely hesitated before shaking his head. "No need. Just happy to help." The woman hesitated. He could feel her staring at him, could practically hear the calculations running through her mind, the way her gaze drifted over his tattered shoes, the damp patches on his sleeves, the tired lines around his eyes. A man like him shouldn't be refusing money. "At least let me give you a ride," she said instead. "You're soaked." Darius hesitated. We're headed to. Wherever it is, I'll take you, she insisted. It's the least I can do. The words were polite, but her tone wasn't a request. It was a decision, a verdict, like she had already made up her mind that he needed her help, that whatever she assumed about his situation had been confirmed by his refusal to take the money. Darius clenched his jaw, debating whether to refuse outright, but then Ariel looked up at him, eyes filled with excitement at the idea of a warm car, and he exhaled. All right, he muttered. Thanks. As they climbed into the Mercedes, the woman turned slightly in her seat, finally offering her name. Eleanor Hastings. Darius froze. The name was familiar. Too familiar. He'd seen it on billboards, on business magazines, in the news. CEO of Hastings Automotive, one of the biggest tech-driven auto companies in the country. But instead of reacting, he simply nodded. He wasn't about to make a fuss. She was just another person, another stranger passing through his life. Ariel, on the other hand, was unfazed. She babbled happily during the ride, talking about how she and her dad always helped people and how kindness was important. Eleanor listened with an odd expression, half amused, half something else. Something unreadable. When they reached the rundown diner, Eleanor pulled out a small notepad from her bag. Give me your number, she said, in case I have another flat tire. Darius hesitated, but eventually scribbled it down on a scrap of paper. He had no illusions. She wouldn't call. People like her never did. Still, as he stepped out into the rain once more, he glanced back just in time to see Eleanor watching him through the windshield, her expression unreadable. Then she drove away, leaving him standing in the storm, the weight of the night settling on his shoulders once again. The next 2 weeks passed in a slow, grinding blur, each day heavier than the last. The rain never seemed to stop, seeping into every crack of the city, just as the weight of Darius's situation seeped into every corner of his mind. The eviction had come swiftly, mercilessly, as if the universe itself had been waiting for him to fail. The diner job had fallen through before it even began. The manager had hired someone else, someone who could start immediately. Now he and Ariel were stuck in a cycle of cold nights spent in shelters when space was available, in their car when it wasn't. The money he'd scraped together from odd jobs barely covered food. His phone screen was cracked, but it still worked, though no one called. Least of all, Eleanor Hastings. Not that he'd expected her to. He tried not to let Ariel see the worst of it, tried to keep the fear out of his voice when she asked why they couldn't go back home, why they had to move from place to place. She was resilient, stronger than any 7-year-old should have to be. But he saw it in her eyes, the creeping understanding that something was very, very wrong. It was on one of those nights, when the cold had settled deep into his bones and he'd spent hours trying to find work, any work, that his phone finally buzzed with an unknown number. He stared at it for a long moment before answering. Darius Carter? The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, but unmistakable. His grip tightened. Yeah, this is Eleanor Hastings. Do you have a moment? His breath stalled for half a second before he forced himself to answer. Yeah, sure. I've been thinking about that night, she said, as if she were discussing the weather. And about you. Darius frowned, unsure where this was going. All right. I ran your name, she continued, unfazed. Looked into your work history. A slow wave of irritation crawled up his spine. Of course she had. Eleanor's words lingered in the air, her tone calm, calculated. I looked into your work history, she repeated. Darius clenched his jaw. A slow wave of irritation crawled up his spine. Of course, she had. People like her always did things on their terms, moving pieces around the board without asking if anyone wanted to play. Didn't realize I was being investigated, he said, his voice carefully neutral. There was a brief pause, then a dry chuckle. You fixed my car in the pouring rain and didn't take my money. Forgive me for being curious. Darius exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. He didn't have time for this. Look, Miss Hastings, if this is about charity. It's not, she cut in, her voice sharp, decisive. My company is expanding. We're opening a new manufacturing facility, and frankly, we need people who actually know what the hell they're doing. I saw your records, your past work at Wexler Auto. You were one of their best mechanics before the company shut down. That's not something I ignore. Darius went still. I need a lead mechanic for our maintenance team, she continued, her tone unwavering. Someone I can trust to handle things without needing their hand held. If you're interested, we can talk details. His heart pounded against his ribs. He almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A job. A real job. Not some off-the-books gig, not a patchwork of side hustles that barely kept them afloat. A real, stable, paying job. But then doubt slithered in, wrapping around his thoughts like barbed wire. People like her didn't just offer opportunities like this. There was always a catch. Why me? His voice was quieter now, but firm. You could hire anyone. Someone with more connections. More. He hesitated, then exhaled, the bitterness slipping through before he could stop it. Someone who fits in better with your kind of people. Another pause. When Eleanor spoke again, her tone had shifted. You think I'm handing you this because I feel sorry for you? I think, Darius said carefully, that people like you don't usually notice people like me unless it benefits them. Silence stretched between them, thick, charged. And then, to his surprise, she let out a short laugh, low and humorless. You're not wrong. That admission caught him off guard. But you should know something, Carter, she went on, voice steady. I grew up in a house that barely had heat in the winter. I know what it's like to watch your parents break their backs just to keep the lights on. And I know how fast people like me forget where they came from once they have enough money to pretend they were never there. Darius clenched his jaw, unsure how to respond. This isn't charity, she said again, more forcefully this time. I don't hire people because I feel bad for them. I hire them because they're good. You're good. And I need good people. He sat there, the weight of her words settling into his ribs. He wanted to say yes. God, he wanted to. But the part of him that had been beaten down by years of disappointment, of being overlooked, of being second-guessed, whispered warnings in the back of his mind. What's the catch? He asked finally. You prove yourself first, she said without hesitation. 30-day probation. You work, you get paid. You do the job right, the position is yours permanently. You screw around, I find someone else. A test. It made sense. It was fair, even. And yet, part of him still bristled at the idea of having to prove himself to someone who had likely never had to prove herself a day in her life. But then he thought of Ariel, curled up in the back seat of their car last night, her tiny body shivering despite the blankets he'd wrapped around her. He thought of the way her voice had wavered when she asked if things would get better. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he took a breath and answered. When do I start? Darius stood outside the Hastings automotive facility, gripping the strap of his worn-out duffel bag as the morning sun glared off the massive glass windows of the main office. The building loomed over him, a sleek, modern structure of steel and tinted glass, a stark contrast to the rundown garages and auto shops he was used to. His stomach twisted with a familiar knot of unease. It wasn't just nerves. It was the feeling of stepping into a world that wasn't built for him. A world where men like him were only ever seen in coveralls, with their heads down, fixing things in the background. Ariel clung to his side, her small fingers curling around his wrist as she gazed up at the building with wide eyes. Is this where you're gonna work, Daddy? She asked, her voice laced with excitement. And something else. Hope. Yeah, baby, Darius murmured, forcing a smile he didn't quite feel. This is it. He led her toward the entrance, where a receptionist greeted him with a polite but stiff expression. Her eyes flicked over his faded jeans and scuffed boots before settling on Ariel. You must be Mr. Carter, she said, her tone clipped. Miss Hastings is expecting you. Darius nodded, keeping his face neutral as the woman picked up the phone and murmured something too quiet for him to hear. A moment later, Eleanor appeared at the end of the hall, her sharp heels clicking against the pristine tile floor. She was dressed in a crisp gray blazer and slacks, her hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. She moved with purpose, her gaze scanning Darius as she approached, assessing him in that way she always seemed to. "You're on time," she noted, as if mildly surprised. "Figured that'd be a good start," Darius said dryly. Her lips quirked, but she didn't smile. Instead, she looked down at Ariel, who clung to Darius's leg but stared back at Eleanor with unfiltered curiosity. "I thought we agreed he'd start today," the receptionist interjected, her tone shifting ever so slightly, an edge creeping into her voice. "Is she going to be staying here?" Darius stiffened. He recognized that tone. The barely concealed irritation. The unspoken assumption that his daughter was a problem. That she didn't belong. He opened his mouth to respond, but Eleanor beat him to it. "She'll be fine," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the air with quiet authority. She turned to Darius. "We have an employee daycare down the hall. You can leave her there while you're working." Darius hesitated, glancing down at Ariel. "You okay with that, baby girl?" Ariel looked up at him, then back at Eleanor, then finally nodded. "Yeah. I can make new friends." Eleanor gave a slight nod, then gestured for Darius to follow her. He walked beside her through the facility, past towering machinery and gleaming assembly lines. The smell of oil and metal filled the air, familiar and grounding. "Let's get one thing straight," Eleanor said as they moved past a group of workers, all clad in identical Navy uniforms. "I didn't hire you because I like you. I hired you because you know your way around an engine, and I need this place running at full efficiency." Darius smirked. "Trust me, I wasn't under any illusions that you liked me." She shot him a sidelong glance, but continued. "Your job is to lead the maintenance team. Make sure these machines don't break down, and fix them when they do. But you're on probation. You mess up, you're out." "Understood." Darius nodded. Crystal clear. They stepped into the main garage, where a group of men stood huddled near a row of workstations, talking in low voices. As soon as Eleanor entered, they straightened, their conversations halting. Darius felt their eyes land on him. Scanning, measuring, judging. Eleanor announced, "Everyone, this is Darius Carter. He'll be overseeing maintenance." A beat of silence stretched through the room before one of the men, tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, stepped forward. "Overseeing maintenance, huh?" The man crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "That's funny. I thought we already had people for that." Eleanor's tone didn't change. "And now you have someone better." A murmur rippled through the group. The bearded man's smirk widened. "Better, huh?" He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. "No offense, boss, but you sure about that?" Eleanor didn't blink. "If you have an issue, Marcus, take it up with me. Otherwise, get back to work." Marcus held her gaze a beat too long before shrugging. "Just making conversation." But Darius knew exactly what kind of conversation it was. The tension in the garage was thick, lingering like the scent of oil and metal in the air. Marcus gave Darius one last measured look before turning on his heel, walking away with an exaggerated slowness that spoke volumes. Darius exhaled quietly, keeping his expression neutral. He knew the type. Men like Marcus always needed to remind others of their place. He'd met them in every shop, every job, every corner of his life. They weren't the ones who shouted their intentions. No, they smiled while they did their damage. Eleanor didn't say anything else as she turned and strode off, heels clicking against the polished floor. The rest of the team slowly went back to their stations, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Darius rolled his shoulders, adjusting his grip on his duffel bag. If they thought they were going to break him with a few side eyes and cold shoulders, they had another thing coming. He'd dealt with worse. He found his workstation, set down his things, and did what he always did when things felt stacked against him. He worked. The first week passed in a grind of long hours and silent tests. Darius kept his head down, focused on the machines, the work, the familiar rhythm of metal and oil. He didn't need to win anyone over. He just needed to do his job. To prove, not to them, but to himself, that he belonged here. But the hostility in the garage hung thick in the air, unspoken but undeniable. It was in the way the other mechanics exchanged glances when he walked in. The way conversations would quiet whenever he approached. And Marcus? Marcus was always watching. Always smirking. Always finding little ways to remind Darius that this wasn't his space. It was in the small things, the missing tools when he reached for them, the forgotten instructions that left him fixing mistakes that weren't his. It was in the way Marcus would laugh just a little too loud, making some joke just low enough for Darius to know it was about him, but not loud enough to call him on it. Still, Darius swallowed it down, grinding through each day. He had Ariel to think about. He had no room for pride. He took every setback in stride, knowing that proving himself meant more than fighting battles that weren't worth it. Then the machine broke. It was a press, one of the biggest in the facility. A multi-million-dollar piece of equipment that shaped aluminum body frames before they moved down the line. When it stopped working, everything stopped. A halt like that cost the company thousands of dollars every hour. Darius was working on a conveyor belt in the back when he heard the commotion. Eleanor was already there when he arrived, standing with arms crossed, her expression unreadable as a handful of engineers and managers stood around the silent machine. Marcus was there too, leaning against a toolbox, watching. "Let me guess," Marcus drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Must be some bad luck bringing in new management." Darius ignored him, stepping forward. "What's the issue?" One of the engineers, a wiry man in a crisp uniform, shot him a skeptical look but answered anyway. "The press started making an off-rhythm grinding noise this morning," the man said. "Then it just stopped altogether. We already tried a soft reset, checked the pneumatic systems. Nothing." Darius nodded, already running through possible causes in his head. The press was massive, but the problem had to be internal, something disrupting the normal cycle. "Who was working on it last?" he asked. Marcus gave an exaggerated shrug. "Couldn't tell you. We all do our part." Darius ignored the jab, moving toward the control panel. The screen blinked with error codes, but he barely glanced at them. Error codes only told part of the story. What mattered was the sound. The feeling of the machine itself. He stepped up to the main body of the press, running a hand along its frame, feeling the vibration low, uneven. Like a beast still breathing, but barely. He knew this kind of machine. He'd worked on older models before. He glanced at the floor beneath it oil. Just a faint trace, but enough to confirm his suspicion. "Hydraulic issue," he muttered. He turned to Eleanor. "You got schematics?" She nodded toward one of the engineers, who handed him a tablet. Darius studied it for only a few seconds before setting it down and rolling up his sleeves. "I need access to the lower panel. Can someone pull it?" The engineers hesitated, exchanging glances. One of them, a younger guy, moved as if to help, but Marcus let out a low chuckle. "Man, you serious?" Marcus shook his head. "You think you're gonna fix this thing like it's some old junker in a backyard shop? You don't just look at it and figure it out." Darius clenched his jaw. He could feel all the eyes on him. Waiting. Waiting for what? For him to snap? To back down? He turned, locking eyes with Marcus. "Yeah," he said simply. "That's exactly what I do." And then, without another word, he dropped to one knee, reached under the machine, and got to work. It wasn't easy. The space was cramped. The bolts were rusted from years of exposure. The hydraulic system was nestled deep in the frame. But Darius had done harder things in worse conditions, with worse odds stacked against him. He worked by feel. By instinct, letting his hands tell him what the machine couldn't. It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of sweat. Of ignored comments from the men watching. Of biting his tongue every time he heard Marcus scoff. But when he tightened the last bolt, when he stood up and wiped the grease from his hands, he knew. "Try it now," he called. One of the engineers hesitated before moving to the control panel, fingers hovering over the restart sequence. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed the button. A long pause. Then, the press came to life. Metal groaning as the massive machine roared back into motion. The rhythm smooth, uninterrupted. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of failure. It was the silence of disbelief. Darius exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. Looks like it's not junk after all, he muttered. Eleanor was the first to speak. You just saved us thousands in downtime, she said, her voice even, controlled. But there was something in her eyes. A flicker of something she hadn't expected to find. Marcus's jaw was tight. His smirk, gone. Guess we got lucky, he muttered. Darius wiped his hands on a rag, meeting his gaze head-on. Guess so. And just like that, the balance shifted. The shift in the garage was subtle at first. But Darius felt it. It was in the way conversations didn't die as quickly when he walked in. In the way some of the younger mechanics started asking him questions instead of ignoring him. Respect wasn't given in places like this. It was earned. And whether they liked it or not, he had earned it. But not everyone was ready to accept that. Marcus had been quieter since the press incident. But that didn't mean he was done. If anything, his silence felt more dangerous. Like a storm waiting for the right moment to break. And Darius wasn't naive. He knew men like Marcus. Men who had spent their whole lives secure in the idea that their place in the world was unshakable. That people like Darius belonged beneath them. Invisible. Until needed. And when that balance got disrupted, they didn't let it slide. The hit came at the worst possible time. And this time, Marcus didn't just want Darius gone. He wanted to make sure he never had another chance again. Marcus had been waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for a way to strike without making it obvious. And when the opportunity came, he took it. It was a Friday afternoon, near the end of the shift. The facility had been running smooth all week. No major breakdowns. No setbacks. Darius was starting to think, just maybe, this could work. He could make this stick. And then, right when he was finishing up an inspection, Eleanor's voice cut through the noise of the garage. Darius. She called his name from across the floor. A word. A summons. Darius wiped the grease from his hands as he approached. He could feel the eyes on him. Conversations quieted. Eleanor didn't call people out unless it was serious. She folded her arms, her face unreadable. I just got an incident report. Darius frowned. What incident? Eleanor held up a clipboard. A faulty recalibration on line 2. She didn't blink. One of the hydraulic arms nearly crushed a casing. Darius stiffened. That's impossible. Eleanor's voice remained neutral. It happened. His pulse pounded against his skull. He had checked line 2 himself. Double-checked it. I didn't miss that. His voice was firm. Eleanor didn't react. Then how did it happen? The question hung in the air. A challenge. A test. And that's when Darius felt it. The weight of another stare. A presence. He turned. And saw Marcus. Leaning against a workbench. Arms crossed. Smirking. And in that instant, Darius knew. It had been him. A sabotage. Small enough to avoid immediate catastrophe. Big enough to get Darius blamed. His fingers curled into fists. The fire in his chest burned hot. But he forced himself to stay calm. If he lost his temper now, it was over. That's what Marcus wanted. Darius exhaled through his nose. Turned back to Eleanor. And said, Give me 20 minutes. Her eyes flicked toward Marcus. Then back to Darius. A hesitation. Then she handed him the clipboard. 20 minutes. Darius turned and strode toward line 2. He barely heard the murmurs that followed. He could feel Marcus's eyes on him. Feel the unspoken challenge in the air. But Darius didn't engage. He had a job to do. 15 minutes. That's how long it took him to find it. A slight misalignment in the pressure sensors. Not something that would be caught on a quick scan. But enough to cause the malfunction. The kind of mistake a real mechanic wouldn't make. The kind of mistake someone had to create. Darius straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow. He could march over to Marcus. Throw the evidence in his face. Demand Eleanor take action. But men like Marcus were careful. He'd deny it. Act offended. Make it a he said situation. And if Darius lost his cool, that would be all the excuse they needed to write him off. No. If Marcus wanted to play a game, Darius would play smarter. He grabbed a wrench. Adjusted the calibration. fixed the issue in under a minute, then turned, walking back to Eleanor, holding the clipboard out to her. Fixed. She scanned his face. Darius glanced at Marcus, then back at her. He saw the unspoken question in her eyes. Did he know what had really happened? Of course, he did. But instead, he just said, "Must have been a mistake." A long pause. Eleanor's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. Then, slowly, she nodded. She turned to the room, raised her voice just enough. "Line 2 is cleared. Back to work." The tension broke. The men shuffled back to their stations. And Marcus didn't look quite so smug anymore. Darius met his eyes just for a second, and gave him the smallest nod. Message received. Marcus didn't own this place. And if he wanted Darius gone, he was going to have to try a hell of a lot harder. The 30-day probation ended with little ceremony. There was no grand announcement, no formal meeting, just an email from HR confirming his full-time position, a company badge with his name on it, and a set of keys to the maintenance office. The job was his. Darius stared at the badge for a long moment, fingers tracing the embossed letters. It should have felt like a victory, but he knew better. This wasn't the finish line. It was just another starting point. Marcus had been quieter since the Line 2 incident. But Darius wasn't naive. The man wasn't the type to let things go. Still, Marcus wasn't his concern anymore. His concern was Ariel. And for the first time in too long, he could finally give her some stability. That afternoon, he picked her up from the company daycare. She greeted him with an excited grin, holding up a crayon drawing of their new life. Him. And a big house, with flowers out front. "Do you like it?" she asked, eyes bright. Darius swallowed past the lump in his throat. "Yeah, baby girl. I like it a lot." As they walked toward the parking lot, Eleanor was waiting by his car, dressed down for once. A simple blouse and slacks instead of her usual corporate armor. She held a coffee in one hand, her expression unreadable. "Carter. Boss." She smirked. "You can call me Eleanor now. You made it." Darius raised an eyebrow. "So that's it? I'm in." She sipped her coffee. "You were in the second you fixed that press. This was just to see if you'd quit before we got here." Darius huffed a laugh, shaking his head. "Figures." She hesitated, glanced at Ariel, then back at him. "Listen." Her voice was quieter now, more deliberate. "I don't do this often, but I wanted to say something." Darius waited. "You were right." He tilted his head. She exhaled. "Back when we first talked, people like me don't usually notice people like you. And when we do, it's not always for the right reasons." Darius didn't respond. He just let her talk. "I didn't help you because I felt bad. I helped because I saw someone who deserved the chance." She hesitated, looked down at her coffee, then back up. "But that doesn't change the fact that I get to make decisions like that. And you don't." A pause, then quieter. "I don't know if that's fair." Darius studied her. "It's not." Eleanor nodded, as if she expected that answer. "Well, maybe that's something I can work on." Darius raised an eyebrow. "Why me?" She took another sip of coffee. "Considering." "Because you remind me of someone." Darius frowned. "Who?" "My dad." She shifted her weight, looked away for half a second, then back. "He worked in a shop just like this. Fought to keep us above water when no one else would give him a shot." A pause. "He died before I ever made it out of that life. But I think if someone had just given him the right opportunity, things might have been different." She glanced at him. "So maybe I was trying to fix something I couldn't back then." Darius let out a slow breath. He hadn't expected that. Ariel tugged at his hand, oblivious to the weight of the conversation. "Daddy, can we get ice cream?" Darius chuckled, ruffled her curls. "Yeah, baby girl. We can do that." He looked back at Eleanor. She gave him the faintest nod. "See you Monday, Carter." "See you Monday." The fight for respect. Monday morning started like any other. The scent of oil and steel filled the garage, and the hum of machinery echoed through the vast facility. Darius arrived early, like always, walking in with his toolbox slung over his shoulder and a coffee in hand. The usual routine. The usual stares. Most of the workers had begun to acknowledge him, some with nods, others with brief words of respect. He had proven himself. But there were still a few who weren't ready to accept him. And at the top of that list was Marcus. Darius had expected the man to try something again, but weeks had passed with nothing more than a few passive-aggressive comments and icy glares. Until today. Today, Marcus wasn't just waiting for Darius to fail. He was going to make sure of it. The sabotage. Darius was inspecting one of the presses when he heard a commotion near the assembly line. A worker was shouting, waving for help. Something had gone wrong. Darius moved quickly, cutting across the floor toward the scene. Workers had already gathered, whispering in hushed voices. One of the conveyor belts had jammed, metal components piling up, the entire line grinding to a halt. A breakdown like this meant a massive delay, one that could cost the company tens of thousands of dollars in lost productivity. Eleanor was already there, speaking with one of the managers. When she spotted Darius, she waved him over. "What happened?" he asked. Eleanor crossed her arms, eyes sharp. "That's what I need you to figure out." Darius crouched beside the conveyor system, examining the mechanism. It didn't take long to find the issue. A wrench, lodged deep inside the track, blocking the belt's movement. His gut twisted. This wasn't an accident. Someone had placed it there. And he had a pretty good idea who. Darius slowly stood, glancing around the room. Marcus was there, leaning against a workbench, arms crossed. Watching. Waiting. The smirk on his face told Darius everything he needed to know. It was a setup. A trap. If Darius called it out, Marcus would play innocent, claim it was a mistake. If Darius lost his temper, he'd look unprofessional. Either way, Marcus won. Unless Darius played smarter. Turning the tables. Darius exhaled through his nose. "Give me 10 minutes, he told Eleanor. She raised an eyebrow but nodded. Darius got to work, removing the wrench, checking for further damage. The belt itself was fine. The jam had stopped the machinery before anything serious could happen. Within minutes, he had the line moving again. Problem solved. But he wasn't done. He stood, turning toward Marcus, locking eyes with him across the room. Then, he raised the wrench. Loud enough for everyone to hear, he asked, "Hey, Marcus, you missing something?" A few workers turned, watching the exchange. Marcus's smirk twitched. "What are you talking about?" Darius held up the wrench, inspecting it. "This got jammed in the conveyor system. Thought you might recognize it." Marcus shrugged. "Could be anybody's." Darius walked toward him slowly. "Could be. But it's got your initials scratched into the handle." A flicker of something passed through Marcus's eyes. Caught. The workers were listening now, shifting uneasily. Darius tilted his head. "So, either you dropped it and didn't notice." He let the implication hang. Marcus scoffed. "You accusing me of something, Carter?" Darius smiled. "Not at all. Just figured someone as experienced as you wouldn't be careless enough to leave his tools lying around where they could jam up a conveyor belt." More murmurs from the other workers. Marcus's jaw tightened. Darius took one last step forward, just close enough that only Marcus could hear his next words. "Try it again," he murmured. "And I'll make sure Eleanor knows exactly what you're up to." Marcus stared at him. For the first time, there was no smirk. Darius pressed the wrench into his chest, giving him a pat on the shoulder before turning away. The message was clear. Marcus had tried to take him down. And he had failed, earning his place. By the end of the day, the garage felt different. Word had spread. People had seen what happened. And for the first time since he started, Darius didn't feel like an outsider. People nodded when he walked past. Some even spoke to him, mechanics who had stayed silent before, now showing him the respect he had earned. Eleanor found him before he left for the night. "You handled that well," she said. Darius shrugged. "Figured you wouldn't want to fight breaking out in the middle of the shop." She smirked. "You figured right." A pause. Then, quieter, "You think he'll try something again?" Darius exhaled. "He might. But if he does, he won't be as bold next time. Eleanor studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. I'll keep an eye on him. Darius nodded back. Eleanor hesitated, then said, I've been thinking. Darius raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerous. She rolled her eyes. I started a mentorship program last year, taking some of our younger workers and giving them a path into leadership roles. I think you'd be a good fit. Darius blinked. That he hadn't expected. Me? Eleanor nodded. You've already proven you can lead. The rest is just training. Darius considered it. For a long time, he had spent his life reacting, just surviving. But this was something more. A chance to move forward. To build something. For himself. For Ariel. Slowly, he nodded. I'm in. Eleanor smiled. Good. The road ahead. That night, Darius picked up Ariel from daycare. She ran to him, beaming. Daddy, guess what? What? I made a new friend today. Darius chuckled. That's great, baby girl. She beamed, skipping beside him as they walked to the truck. As he strapped her in, she looked up at him, eyes bright. Are we gonna stay here now, Daddy? Darius paused. Then, for the first time in a long time, he was able to give her the answer he had been waiting to say. Yeah, baby girl. He smiled. We're staying. Darius drove through the quiet streets of Chicago, the hum of the engines steady beneath his hands. Ariel was in the back seat, chattering about her day, her words running together in excitement. He half listened, letting the sound of her voice fill the space. It was a good sound. A familiar, comforting one. For the first time in a long time, there wasn't a pit in his stomach when he thought about tomorrow. He wasn't scrambling to find another job. He wasn't counting pennies to see if he had enough for dinner. There was food in the fridge, gas in the truck, and a paycheck that would come again next week. He pulled into the apartment complex, the one he had barely dared to hope for when he first started at Hastings Automotive. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. A 2-bedroom with an old but working heater and enough space for Ariel to have a bed of her own. No more back seats. No more shelters. Just a home. Ariel jumped out of the truck as soon as he unbuckled her, racing up the stairs. She always got excited to come home now, to her room with its pink walls and stuffed animals lined neatly on the bed. Darius followed, feeling the ache in his muscles from the long day. His hands were rough, stained with oil even after scrubbing, but he didn't mind. They were working hands, hands that had built something. Inside, Ariel was already rummaging through her backpack, pulling out crayons and paper. Daddy, can you draw with me? She asked, looking up at him with wide eyes. Darius chuckled. Baby girl, I draw worse than you do. She giggled. That's okay. I can teach you. He didn't argue. He sat beside her on the living room floor, watching as she scribbled colorful shapes across the page. She handed him a crayon, and he made an attempt at a car, though it ended up looking more like a misshapen box. Ariel laughed so hard she fell over. Darius shook his head, smiling. These were the moments he had fought for. The small, quiet ones. Later, after dinner, he tucked Ariel into bed, smoothing her blankets as she yawned. Daddy, she murmured sleepily. Yeah, baby. You like your job? Darius thought about it. He thought about the hard days, the long hours, the way he still had to fight for respect in a place where not everyone wanted him there. But then he thought about fixing that press. About proving himself. About standing up to Marcus without losing everything. He thought about Eleanor, offering him something more than just a job. A future. And he thought about this moment, his daughter, warm and safe in a home they had built. He brushed a hand over her curls. Yeah, baby girl, he said softly. I like it a lot. She smiled, eyes closing as she drifted off to sleep. Darius sat there for a long time, watching her breathe, letting the quiet settle around him. Tomorrow would be another long day. There would be more challenges, more battles to fight. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. The weeks passed and Darius found himself settling into a rhythm he had almost forgotten existed. Work, home, dinner with Ariel, bedtime stories, and then, before he went to sleep, a quiet moment to himself, sitting on the small balcony outside their apartment, staring at the city lights, thinking about how quickly life had changed. At the shop, things had shifted, if only slightly. The mechanics who had once barely acknowledged him now asked his opinion on repairs. Some still held back, but the respect was there, even if grudging. He had proven himself, and in a place like Hastings Automotive, that counted for something. Eleanor was true to her word about the mentorship program. Every Thursday, she pulled him into a small office near the main floor and ran him through everything: how budgets worked, how to deal with suppliers, how to manage a team. At first, he wasn't sure why she had chosen him. He wasn't the type to be in charge of anything except a wrench and a busted engine. But Eleanor saw something in him, and he wasn't about to waste the opportunity. One evening after a particularly long shift, Darius found himself in the break room, staring into a vending machine, debating whether he had enough energy left to even chew. "Long day?" Eleanor's voice came from behind him. He didn't turn. "Aren't they all?" She stepped beside him, dropping a few coins into the machine, pressing a button. A bag of pretzels fell into the tray. "You're doing well," she said. Darius gave a tired smirk. "That your way of saying I haven't screwed up yet?" Eleanor opened the bag, popping a pretzel into her mouth. "It's my way of saying I don't waste my time on people who don't belong here." Darius leaned against the counter, glancing at her. "Why are you really doing this?" Eleanor chewed, swallowed, then exhaled. "Because I know what it's like to start from the bottom and have people look at you like you don't belong. I had to fight my way into this world. I had help along the way, but not enough. I don't want to be the kind of person who pulls the ladder up behind me." Darius studied her, then nodded. "Besides," she added, smirking, "you're the best damn mechanic I've got. Can't have you wasting all that talent under a car your whole life." He chuckled. "Well, guess I'll have to stick around then." "Guess you will." They stood there for a moment, the hum of the machines outside the only sound between them. Darius knew he still had a long way to go. Marcus wasn't done making his life difficult, and there would always be people who doubted him. But he also knew he wasn't alone in this. For the first time in a long time, he had people in his corner. The days stretched into weeks, and soon enough, months had passed. Life had settled into something steady, something Darius hadn't felt in years. The early mornings, the late shifts, the quiet nights at home with Ariel, they all blended into a rhythm that no longer felt like survival. It felt like living. At work, things had shifted in ways he hadn't expected. There were still days when it felt like a battle. Marcus still had his moments, throwing sharp comments or setting little obstacles in Darius's way, but the difference was, people were starting to see through it. More than once, a younger mechanic had stepped in, offering Darius a tool before Marcus could conveniently misplace it. There were nods of respect when he walked through the garage, and when something needed fixing, people didn't hesitate to come to him. It wasn't about proving himself anymore. He belonged. One evening, after finishing up a repair, one of the newer guys, Jason, a kid barely out of trade school, lingered by the tool bench. "Hey, Carter," Jason said, hesitating. Darius wiped his hands on a rag. "What's up?" Jason shifted, glancing toward the other mechanics before lowering his voice. "Look, man. I wanted to say, I see how you handle things. With Marcus, with all of it. And, he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. It makes a difference, you know?" Darius raised an eyebrow. "You saying I'm a role model now?" Jason smirked. "Something like that." He hesitated again, then added, "Just don't let them push you out. Some of us need to see that you can make it here." Darius looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm not going anywhere." Jason nodded back, as if that was exactly what he needed to hear, then grabbed his wrench and got back to work. Darius let out a slow breath. He hadn't asked to be anyone's example. But if his presence made things even a little easier for the next guy in line, maybe that was worth something. Later that night, as he walked out to the parking lot, Eleanor was waiting by his truck. "That's starting to be a habit," he said, unlocking the door. Eleanor shrugged. Maybe I just enjoy ruining your quiet moments. Darius smirked but didn't argue. She crossed her arms, leaning against the side of his truck. We've got a new project coming up. Expansion on the west end of the facility. We're going to need people to oversee the maintenance operation. Darius turned to look at her. And? Eleanor met his gaze. I want you to lead it. The words hit him harder than he expected. A promotion. A real step forward. More responsibility. More pay. More stability for Ariel. But more than that, it was trust. Eleanor wasn't offering him a job anymore. She was offering him a future. Darius exhaled, running a hand over his beard. You sure about that? Might be better off with someone who... I'm not better off with anyone else, she interrupted. You've already been leading half the garage without the title. It's time you got the recognition for it. He stared at her for a long moment, searching for any hesitation. There was none. She meant it. Darius nodded slowly. Then I'm in. Eleanor smirked, pushing off the truck. Good. You start Monday. She turned to leave, but before she got too far, Darius called after her. Eleanor. She stopped, looking back. Thanks, he said, and for once, he wasn't just thanking her for the opportunity. He was thanking her for seeing him. She gave him a small nod. See you Monday, Carter. As she walked away, Darius sat in his truck, gripping the wheel. This was it. A new chapter. A real future. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, he knew he wasn't doing it alone. Monday morning came faster than Darius expected. The weight of his new role settled on his shoulders as he stepped into the facility, but it wasn't the crushing pressure he had once feared. It was a challenge. A responsibility. A chance. The garage was already alive with movement, the steady hum of machines filling the air. Workers moved between workstations, conversations blending with the clatter of tools. It was the same place he had walked into months ago, but everything felt different now. He wasn't the outsider anymore. As he made his way toward the maintenance office, his office now, he caught sight of Marcus near the tool bench, watching him. The tension that had once existed between them was still there, but it had changed. Marcus didn't smirk like before. He didn't make snide remarks. He had tried to push Darius out and failed. Now, Marcus was just another mechanic. Darius nodded in his direction, a silent truce. Marcus hesitated, then gave a slight nod back before turning to his work. That was enough. Inside the office, Darius set down his bag and exhaled. The desk was clean, a fresh notepad sitting beside a company-issued laptop. He barely had time to take it all in before there was a knock on the door. Jason poked his head in. Hey, boss. Darius raised an eyebrow at the word, but Jason just grinned. Couple of the guys are waiting near the loading dock, Jason continued. We've got the first shipment of parts for the expansion coming in. Darius grabbed his notepad and stood. Then let's get to work. The words felt right. Familiar. Like he had always been meant to say them. Over the next few months, Darius threw himself into the new role. It wasn't easy. Managing a team, handling logistics, making sure everything ran smoothly, it was a different kind of challenge. But he adapted. He learned quickly, picking up things Eleanor had taught him, figuring out the rest as he went. There were setbacks, late nights, and more than a few moments of frustration, but at the end of the day, the work got done. And people took notice. More than once, workers from other departments came to him for advice. The younger mechanics followed his lead, and even some of the older guys, ones who had been in the industry longer than him, listened when he spoke. Respect wasn't something you demanded in a place like this. It was something you earned. And Darius had earned it. One evening, as he was wrapping up paperwork, Eleanor stopped by his office. You settling in? She asked, leaning against the doorway. Darius smirked. You checking up on me? Eleanor crossed her arms. I don't check up on people. I check in on investments. Darius chuckled. That's supposed to make me feel better? She shrugged. Depends. You still feel like you don't belong here. Darius leaned back in his chair, thinking about it. Then he shook his head. Nah, Not anymore. Eleanor nodded, satisfied. Good. She turned to leave, but paused. By the way, corporate wants to expand the mentorship program next year. Thinking of adding leadership training for mechanics looking to move up. I told them I had someone in mind to help run it. Darius raised an eyebrow. You volunteering me for more work? Eleanor smirked. You'll thank me later. She walked out before he could argue. Darius chuckled, shaking his head. She was probably right. That night, he picked up Ariel from daycare. She ran to him like always, arms wide, giggling as he scooped her up. Daddy, we had a science day today. I made a volcano. Darius grinned. A real volcano? Well, it was in a cup. But it exploded. He laughed, setting her in the truck. As he drove home, Ariel chattered about her day, her excitement filling the space between them. Darius listened, smiling. This was what he had fought for. Not just the job. Not just the paycheck. A future. A home. A life where Ariel didn't have to worry about what came next. As they pulled into the driveway of their apartment, Ariel looked up at him. Daddy? Yeah, baby girl? She smiled sleepily. I think you're really good at fixing things. Darius felt something tighten in his chest. He reached over, ruffling her curls. Yeah, baby girl. He glanced at their home, then back at her. I think I am too. And for the first time in his life, he truly believed it. Life continued, steady and sure. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. Darius found himself adapting to his new role, learning the ins and outs of leadership, of responsibility, of what it meant to not just survive, but to build something real. The mentorship program took off faster than expected. At first, he had doubts about whether he had anything worth teaching. He wasn't some corporate executive, wasn't a man with degrees hanging on his wall. He was just a mechanic. But that was exactly why people listened to him. He knew what it was like to start at the bottom. To be overlooked. To work twice as hard just to be seen. And when the younger guys sat down in that training room, looking at him with the same uncertainty he had once carried, Darius knew what to say. He told them the truth. That skill mattered more than background. That persistence mattered more than connections. That proving yourself wasn't about waiting for someone to hand you a chance. It was about taking it, about showing up every day and refusing to be ignored. And they listened. They learned. And one by one, they started to believe in themselves the way Eleanor had once believed in him. One evening, after wrapping up a session, Eleanor stopped by his office. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. You're good at this. Darius smirked, setting down his notepad. Yeah? That your way of telling me I'm stuck with this job? Eleanor shrugged. You were stuck the minute you agreed to it. He chuckled, shaking his head. Figures. She stepped inside, sitting on the edge of his desk. I was serious, though. You have a way of reaching people. Of making them want to do better. Darius exhaled, running a hand over his beard. Guess I just remember what it's like to be on the other side of that conversation. Eleanor nodded, her expression unreadable. That's why you're here. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope, setting it on the desk in front of him. Darius frowned, picking it up. What's this? Eleanor smirked. Your official offer. His eyes flicked up to her, confused. Offer for what? To move up. Darius blinked. You're not just a lead mechanic anymore, she continued. You've proven you can manage an entire department. Corporate's looking for someone to oversee multiple facilities. A regional supervisor position. I told them I knew the perfect candidate. Darius sat back in his chair, staring at the envelope. A promotion. Another step forward. He had worked for this. Earned it. But still, part of him hesitated. This is a big jump, he said finally. You sure I'm ready for this? Eleanor tilted her head. Are you? Darius thought about it. About the journey that had brought him here. The nights spent in shelters, the days spent wondering if he'd ever catch a break. About Ariel, sleeping in the back seat of their truck, asking him if things would ever get better. And about now, the job, the home, the future he had fought for. He looked up at Eleanor and nodded. I'm ready. She smiled, standing. Good. You start next month. Darius watched her walk out, then looked down at the envelope in his hands. He had come a long way. But he wasn't done yet. And that was the best part. This wasn't the end of his story. Darius stared at the envelope for a long time after Eleanor left. A regional supervisor position. He had started here just trying to survive. Just trying to keep Ariel fed and find a place where they belonged. Now, he was looking at an opportunity that could change everything, not just for himself, but for the people who had been in his shoes, the ones still struggling to get a foot in the door. The weight of it settled deep in his chest, not as fear, but as something else. Something like pride. He had come a long way. But he wasn't done yet. A new chapter. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and training. Eleanor had him sitting in on corporate briefings, shadowing supervisors, learning things he had never even thought about before: supply chain logistics, team management, efficiency reports. It was overwhelming at first. But Darius was no stranger to hard work. He took notes, asked questions, stayed late to study manuals and company policies. He wasn't going to be the guy who got promoted just to fail. And through it all, Ariel kept him grounded. Every night, after he put her to bed, he sat at the kitchen table, reviewing documents and spreadsheets. And every night, she would peek out from her room, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Daddy, you still working?" Darius chuckled, setting down his pen. "Yeah, baby girl. Just learning some new stuff." Ariel climbed onto his lap, yawning. "You're gonna be the boss now?" He smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Something like that." She grinned, her eyes fluttering shut. "That's cool, but don't forget to sleep." Darius chuckled. "I won't, baby." But even after she went back to bed, he sat there for a while, staring at the papers in front of him. The kid was right. This wasn't just about work. It was about making sure he didn't lose sight of why he was doing all of this in the first place. The final test. The last hurdle before officially stepping into his new role came in the form of a company-wide meeting. Eleanor called him into her office one morning, tossing a schedule onto his desk. "We're presenting the expansion plans to the senior board," she said. "I want you to be the one to explain how the maintenance department is handling the shift." Darius blinked. "You want me to present?" She nodded. "They need to see who's going to be leading this. And you need to see that you belong in that room." Darius exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You sure about this?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You think I'd put you in front of the board if I wasn't?" "Fair point." So, he prepared. He went over the reports, met with department heads, memorized numbers. By the time the meeting came, he was ready. Mostly. The boardroom was filled with men in suits, the kind of people Darius used to fix cars for, not sit across from. He felt the weight of their gazes as he stood beside Eleanor at the head of the table. She introduced him, then stepped back, giving him the floor. Darius took a deep breath and started talking. At first, he kept it simple, explaining the expansion process, how the maintenance department was adapting, what improvements they had already made. Then one of the board members, a man with gray hair and an expensive watch, leaned forward, frowning. "You're suggesting we overhaul the current equipment budget," the man said. "Why would we invest more when the existing system is functional?" Darius met his gaze without hesitation. "Because functional isn't the same as efficient. We're spending more on repairs because the old system keeps breaking down. Replacing it now will cut costs in the long run." The board murmured among themselves. Eleanor smirked. Another member spoke up. "And you're confident this will work?" Darius nodded. "I've been on the floor every day for the past year. I know these machines inside and out. I wouldn't be standing here recommending this if I wasn't sure." The room fell silent for a moment. Then the man with the gray hair sat back, nodding slightly. "All right," he said. "I trust Eleanor's judgment. If she believes in you, I'll give you the same chance." Darius exhaled slowly as Eleanor stepped forward. "Then let's move forward." The meeting ended, and as the board members filed out, Eleanor clapped a hand on Darius's shoulder. "See," she said. "You belong here." Darius let out a small laugh. "Guess I do." Moving forward. His first official day as regional supervisor felt like a blur. New responsibilities, more meetings, a schedule that barely left room for a break. But at the end of the day, he still found himself back on the garage floor, walking the rows of machines, talking to the mechanics. Because no matter how much he moved up, he wasn't going to forget where he started. Marcus had transferred to another branch, which meant the tension in the facility had finally eased. The younger mechanics, Jason included, had stepped up, eager to learn. And for the first time, Darius wasn't just another worker. He was the guy people came to for answers, for advice, for leadership. One evening, as he was packing up, Eleanor stopped by his office. "You still alive?" she asked, smirking. "Barely," he admitted. She tossed him a key. Darius caught it, frowning. "What's this?" "Company car," she said. "Comes with the job." He stared at it. "You serious?" Eleanor crossed her arms. "Would I joke about free transportation?" Darius shook his head, laughing. "Damn. From fixing cars to getting one for free." Eleanor grinned. "Full circle." He stood, slipping the key into his pocket. "Guess I owe you one." She tilted her head. "You don't owe me anything, Carter." She hesitated, then added, "Just don't forget to pull someone else up when you get the chance." Darius met her gaze. Wouldn't dream of it. The life he built. That night, he pulled up outside their apartment in the company car. Ariel ran outside as soon as she saw him, eyes wide. "Daddy, is this ours?" Darius scooped her up, spinning her around. "It's mine, but you get to ride in it." She giggled. "Can I press the buttons?" Darius chuckled. "Only the safe ones." She climbed into the back seat, inspecting every inch with the excitement only a child could have. As he leaned against the hood, watching her, something settled deep in his chest. This was it. This was what he had fought for. Not just the job. Not just the paycheck. But a life. A future. A home where Ariel didn't have to wonder what came next. She had security. Stability. And so did he. Darius looked up at the night sky, exhaling slowly. He had started this journey with nothing but his skills and the belief that things could get better. Now, he had everything he had dreamed of and more. A steady career. A daughter who never had to sleep in the back of a truck again. And the knowledge that he had earned every damn bit of it. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. Ariel leaned out the window. "Daddy, can we go for a ride?" Darius smiled, opening the driver's side door. "Yeah, baby girl," he said, climbing in. "Let's go." As they drove off, the city lights stretching out in front of them, Darius knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. And the road ahead was wide open. The end.